axial skeleton covers 80 bones that are segregated into three main regions. Here we'll be looking at the skull, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax, or what you would call the rib cage. We depict the axial skeleton. You can see here the skull. This would be the vertebral column, and then the bony thorax. These are the regions considered to be the axial skeleton. Later on, we will separately look at the appendages, or the limbs. The first structure that we will look at under the axial skeleton is the skull. Now, the skull is not a single bone. Rather, it's the most complex bony structure. It's formed by cranial bones and facial bones. The cranial bones form the cranium, which protects the brain. It's also where we'll see the site of attachment for head and neck muscles. Separately, we will see the facial bones, and the facial bones supply the framework of the teeth, the face, the sense organs, open passages for air and food passage, and also anchor the facial muscles. Let us begin then with the cranium. In the cranium, there are 8 cranial bones, the paired parietal bones, the paired temporal bones, the singular frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bones, for a total of 8 bones. These cranial bones, being flat bones, are remarkably thin and very strong considering their weight. Taking a look at the frontal bone, we will begin here looking at the anterior aspect of the human skull. The frontal bone here is shown in yellow. Important structures to note: the frontal bone will articulate in the back or posteriorly with the parietal bones at what's called the coronal suture. In the anterior region, the frontal bone will articulate with the nasal bone at the frontonasal suture. This region here is the supraorbital margin, supra meaning above, orbital meaning the orbit of the eye, and a margin is a smooth edge of bone. Here we also see the supraorbital foramen, or the supraorbital notch, which is a small opening in the supraorbital margin. Looking at the lateral aspect, we see the parietal bone. The parietal bone, there are 2 parietal bones which meet at the center at the sagittal suture. The parietal bone creates 4 major sutures. With the frontal bone, we see the coronal suture. With the temporal bone, we see the squamous suture. And finally, with the occipital bone, we see the lambdoid suture. The other bones visible in this aspect would be the occipital bone, temporal bone, and we will get into the facial bones. The different sutures should be able to be identified, and you should be able to identify these on all of the possible views. Looking at the posterior view, here we see the 2 parietal bones. We can clearly see the sagittal suture between the 2 parietal bones running sagittally. Here is the lambdoid bone, the lambdoid suture. That lambdoid suture, this is shaped like an upside down V, which is the Greek letter lambda. This large bone in here is the occipital bone. The occipital bone has some very important structures on it. Down here we see the occipital condyles. These projections that are rounded will form the joint between the occipital bone and the atlas, which will be the first cervical vertebra. From this view, we can also see on the inferior portion of the skull, here would be the occipital bone. Again, those occipital condyles. Now we have this large opening, the foramen magnum. This is a very large opening where the spinal cord would pass out. Here we can see the sutures between the occipital bone and the temporal bone. The next of the cranial bones are the paired temporal bones, one located on each side of the skull where we would have our temples. These are very complex bones. There is a flattened region known as the squamous region that would form the suture with the parietal bone known as the squamosal or the squamous suture. The back region where there's a thickening is called the mastoid region, and that encompasses the mastoid process. There is also an opening called the external acoustic meatus and the tympanic region. This is where you would have the opening from the outside part of the ear and the ear canal. There is also a styloid, or an elongated thin process. Coming off the side and projecting out, we have the zygomatic process. This zygomatic process will articulate on this aspect with the zygoma, or the zygomatic bone. There's also here the mandibular fossa. A fossa is an indent where a joint will occur, and we will see that the mandibular condyle will articulate here in the mandibular fossa. The temporal bone is relatively thin, especially in the region of the squamosal region, and it serves as a weak point within the skull. The major openings of this include the stylomastoid and the jugular foramina, as well as the external and the internal acoustic or auditory meatuses. This would be the opening for the ear canal. The sphenoid bone then would be the most central of the cranial bones. This forms what's considered to be a central wedge. It's also considered to be a keystone bone, in that all of the other cranial bones articulate with the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone, looking at a superior view, so we are looking down on the sphenoid bone, we have this area here known as the greater wing. The smooth part would form part of the orbit of the eye. These regions, called the optic canal, would be where we would see the optic nerve passing through. Where the optic nerve passes through, there is a groove where the optic nerve crosses. That is called the optic chiasma. This then would be the chiasmatic groove. There are numerous foramen located, including the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. If we look at the sphenoid from a different aspect, now we are looking at a posterior view. These regions down here, this looks like the shape of a bat almost. These regions that would represent the feet or the legs of the bat, these are called the pterygoid process. These would line up at the very back of the upper jaw, creating the top portion of the upper jaw. The greater wings project up and would articulate with the cranial bones. This region would form the posterior-most aspect of the orbit of the eye. The final cranial bone that we will talk about is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone lies between the sphenoid and the nasal bone. It forms most of the bony area between the nasal cavity and the orbits. There is a projection that comes up called the crista galli. This actually projects up through a space in the frontal bone. This entire region would then be part of the cranium. We see this area called the cribriform plate, which has very small openings called olfactory foramina. This is where we will see the olfactory neurons coming from the olfactory bulbs passing through into the nasal cavity to allow for our sense of smell. Running down the center, the perpendicular plate will form part of the bony septum that divides the nasal cavity into two halves. The superior and middle nasoconcha will form the lateral aspect of each of the nasal cavities when it interacts with certain facial bones. The masses have many ethmoid sinuses. The sinuses are going to be mucosal-lined spaces within the bone. In addition, we will sometimes see what are called Wormian bones. These are tiny, irregularly shaped bones that appear within sutures, and they can be seen on this diagram here. Every individual would have Wormian bones occurring in different places, some not at all. So these are just two examples of what would be called a Wormian or a sutural bone located within the suture. The next bones we will talk about are the facial bones. There are 14 facial bones, most of which are paired, except for the mandible and the vomer, which are unpaired. The paired bones include the paired maxilla, the paired zygomatic, the paired nasals, the paired lacrimals, the paired palatines, and the paired inferior conchae or inferior nasal conchae. We will begin with the mandible. The mandible forms the lower jaw. It is the largest and strongest bone of the face. This region here, the mandibular condyle, is rounded and it articulates with the mandibular fossa in the temporal bone. This allows for the opening and closing on the jaw. We then have the mandibular notch, and this leads to the coronoid process. This is a projection of bone that would pass underneath the zygomatic arch. The main body of the mandible is the thickened portion, coming up and reaching to the temporal bone. We would have the ramus of the mandible. Located within the body of the mandible, we would have the teeth within their sockets. All along the edge of the bone, there is the smooth edge of the bone known as the alveolar margin. This area here shows you a cutaway of how the teeth actually sit in their sockets. Two main foramen would be the mandibular foramen on the interior aspect of the ramus, and the mental foramen on that exterior aspect of the body of the mandible. These would be the location where important nerves would pass through. Forming the upper jaw, we have the maxilla. The maxilla is paired, so we have a left and a right. The maxilla forms, of course, the upper portion of the jaw. We once again see the alveolar margin where the teeth sit. At the very base of the nose, we have the anterior nasal spine, and this will serve as an anchor point for the nasal cartilage or the septal cartilage that forms the soft cartilaginous part of the nose. We have two main processes that come off of the maxilla. We have the zygomatic process, which will articulate with the zygomatic bone, forming the rest of the cheek structure. We have the frontal process, which will articulate on top with the frontal bone, and in the most anterior aspect with the nasal bones. There's also a smooth orbital surface, and this will form the lower region of the orbit of the eye. The maxilla also folds inward, creating the hard palate. So here, looking at the inferior portion of the skull, we see this zygomatic process of the maxilla, the alveolar margins, the teeth, and here would be the hard palate also formed by the maxilla. The other bones would be the irregularly shaped zygomatic bones that form the prominence of the cheeks. The nasal bones, these are fused bones that form the bridge of the nose. The lacrimal bones that contribute to the medial walls of the orbit, these contain the deep groove known as the lacrimal sac, lacrimal meaning tears. The palatine bones, these bones form plates that form the back region of the hard palate, as well as the walls of the nasal cavity and a very small portion of the orbits. The vomer, mentioned before, is an unpaired bone, and this would form the bony part of the nasal septum. And finally, the inferior nasal conchae. These bones will form part of the lateral walls of the naval cavity, and we will look at these all in situ or in position. From the anterior or frontal view, we can see the zygomatic bone articulating with the zygomatic process of the maxilla and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So this bone here, shown in blue, would be the zygomatic bone. The nasal bone, creating the bridge of the nose. The vomer, creating the bony septum. Interior here, we have those inferior nasal concha, one on each side, creating the walls of the nasal cavity. At the very corner of the eye, containing that tear duct or that lacrimal groove, would be the lacrimal bone. In a lateral aspect view, again we can see this complex shape of the zygomatic bone articulating with the temporal bone here, also the frontal bone. We very clearly see the positioning of the mandible, the relationship between the mandibular condyle and the mandibular fossa. We can now see the groove located within the lacrimal bone. We see some regions of the ethmoid bone. Though the ethmoid bone is considered a cranial bone, it does play a role in some of the facial structure, specifically the orbit of the eye. If we were to look at a mid-sagittal section, we would see the interior portion. This allows us to see certain bones we could not see from the external examination. Here we see the vomer in situ, so the vomer at the very middle, articulating with the septum, articulating with the sphenoid, forming part of the bony septum, along with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Here we see the maxilla forming the jaw and the palate. Also along with the palate, we have this region here of the palatine bone, which would form the most posterior aspects of the palate. We can also see the the articulation between the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone, here is the pterygoid process articulating with the maxilla. And of course, our other cranial bones, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, ethmoid. And looking at the inferior portion of the skull, we can see that the entirety of the palate is made of the maxilla and the region of the palatine bone. Here we would have the region of the vomer, where it articulates with the sphenoid bone. Here we can clearly see the zygomatic arch that is created by the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic process of the maxilla. Once again, we see that foramen magnum, that large opening in the occipital bone. If we were to look at the inferior portion of the skull, so removing the skull cap and looking down, here for bearings, this is the foramen magnum. Here we see the sphenoid bone. This is the region of the ethmoid bone, which is exposed through the frontal bone. Here we have the cristagalli, the cribriform plate with those olfactory foramina. In the sphenoid bone, we would see this being the central wedge, and you can see how it articulates with all of the other cranial bones. Now to look more specifically at the orbits of the eyes. The orbits of the eyes are bony cavities. They are formed by 7 different bones. This is where we have the eyes firmly encased, surrounded by muscle and cushioned by fat. If we focus in on the orbit, we would see the frontal bone. Here is the sphenoid bone. Please note the optic canal where the optic nerve would pass through, as well as the superior and inferior orbital fissures or openings. There is also an infraorbital groove, which is part of the maxilla. We see a small amount of the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, the lacrimal bone, and the palatine bone. The majority of the inferior-lateral wall is formed by the zygomatic bone, as well as the roof being formed by the frontal bone. The nasal cavity is also a complex structure. The roof of the nasal cavity is formed by the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The lateral walls, or side walls, are formed by both the superior and middle conchae of the ethmoid, as well as the inferior nasal conchae. The division in the center would be formed by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and we would also see the floor being formed by the palatine process of the maxilla and the palatine bone. If we take a look at the nasal cavity, here we very clearly see the maxillary bone. We now for the first time have a very good view of the palatine bone, how the palatine bone forms the wall here. You can note that the sphenoid bone and the pterygoid process, how they interact. This is showing you the side wall of the cavity. So here we have the superior and middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. Here we have the inferior nasal concha that is its own separate bone. Here we have part of the maxilla and the edge of the nasal bone. If we put in the central structures, we now have created the septum. The septum is made of the vomer, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, as well as this region here of septal cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage. Another important structure in the skull would be the paranasal sinuses. And these paranasal sinuses, these are mucosa-lined air-filled sacs that are found within the different bones of the skull, specifically the frontal bone, sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, and both of the maxillary bones. These sinuses function as air enters the paranasal sinuses from the nasal cavity. The mucus then will drain into the nasal cavity from the sinuses. This helps to lighten the overall skull and enhance the resonance of the voice. The paranasal sinuses are located around the nasal area. These would be the frontal sinuses, the ethmoid sinuses more towards the anterior aspect, sphenoid sinuses more towards the posterior aspect, and the maxillary sinus located within the maxilla. Now these sinuses can become infected or inflamed. The mucosal lining will then overproduce mucus, leading to congestion, pressure, swelling, and pain in one of these three main regions. Okay. That is called sinusitis. Alright, so continuing on, we've covered the 8 bones of the cranium and the 14 bones of the facial bones, right? They create the face. So together, those create the skull. That's the first part of the axial skeleton. Now, the next thing is called the hyoid bone. Now, the hyoid bone is kind of all by itself. It's not really part of the skull. It's not really part of the vertebral column. It's this U-shaped bone. This is where you're going to have the attachment point for certain neck muscles that raise and lower the larynx during speech and swallowing. It is the only bone in the body that does not articulate with any other bone. So if you take a look at this, this is located in the upper region, right, of the neck, in the area of the throat. This is often, if you watch crime dramas, when they look at a skeleton that has been manually strangulated, this bone is sometimes broken, right, from the force of a manual strangulation. So that is the hyoid bone. That's kind of in its own category, and I just wanted to pop that in there and mention that before we move on to the next main portion of the axial skeleton, which is the vertebral column. Now, the vertebral column is formed by 26 irregular bones. We're going to take a look at these very special structures. Okay? Those bones are the vertebra. We have different numbers, and we classify these according to where they're located along the vertebral column. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae, cervical or neck vertebrae. So these form the neck region. Okay? If you've ever seen somebody who's had a whiplash accident, they wear a big puffy white collar here, and that's called a cervical collar. Then we have 12 bones of the torso. Those 12 bones of the torso, those are the thoracic vertebrae. These are going to be the vertebrae that articulate with the ribs of the bony thorax and create the rib cage. We also have 5 in the lower back. These are called the lumbar vertebrae. So if you have a really good, nice desk chair or a car with a really high-end seat, so you may have lumbar support. Okay, so this is that curved in part under the lower back. The final part then is the sacrum. In the sacrum we actually have fused bones that form the sacrum. They form the back of what's called the pelvic brim, right, or the pelvic girdle, and that forms the rounded portion that creates the pelvis itself. Okay. The last part we'll see as well are called the coxal bones, the coccyx, and those are the tailbones. Now, in order to remember the numbers, a student a long time ago told me to remember the 7, 12, and 5 as you eat breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. Okay, so you remember those in order. Okay. We can take a look at these, right, and see them in situ. So this would be an anterior view. Right. This would be the lateral view or the side view. Okay. So here are C1 through C7. Right. We often refer to the cervical vertebrae as C and then the number. The thoracic, then, we're going to have T1 through T12, right, running along here, and we will look at these independently and see the different structures. L1 through L5, then we have the fused bones of the sacrum, and then finally the coccyx, or the tailbone. If we look at the lateral view, we do see particular curvatures. So we have the cervical curvature, right, the spinous, where the spine sticks out, if you will. This is where we'd have the thoracic curvature. Inward, we would have a lumbar curvature, and then outward, forming the back of the pelvic girdle, we would have the sacrum and the coccyx. Right? So those curvatures are quite important, and when you have issues with those curvatures, it leads to all sorts of problems with your muscle alignment and things of that nature. Now, the way that these are held together, the vertebral column is held together with ligaments. In between each vertebra, we have intervertebral discs, but they're held together then with ligaments. So we have the anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments. Okay. Those longitudinal ligaments, they are going to run basically up and down, right? Running the longitude, right? Long ways. The one that is anterior in the body, okay, now this would be basically the portion of the vertebral column that faces in towards the internal organs. Okay, that is considered anterior. It's more towards the front. Okay. So this is the anterior longitudinal ligament. We have a cutaway here, so we can see that it runs all along. The posterior longitudinal ligament then runs along the back of what's called the body of the vertebrae. the part that comes out towards the back that you can actually feel, the posterior region, what you're feeling are these projections here, which are each called spines. And we'll see that each of these spines is connected through what's called an interspinous ligament. Right? So it connects from one spine to another. There's an interspinous ligament. And then there's a separate ligament that runs down and connects the tips of all these spines, and that is called a supraspinous ligament. You can also see the intervertebral discs. These intervertebral discs, these are going to be a very special kind of cushioning. They are made predominantly of fiber cartilage with a kind of gel on the inside, so we'll see those separately. If we were to take and separate a vertebrae from the one below it, we can now look at that intervertebral disc. Okay. Just to get your bearing, here is the spine of the vertebrae. This rounded portion here would be the body. So this is facing towards the viscera or the organs. This is facing out the back. This is the vertebral disc. The outer ring is called an annulus fibrosus. This is where we have fibrocartilage. If you think about something that's annular, annular means cyclic or circular. Then we have the nucleus pulposus of the disc, which is in the center. Remember, the word nucleus means the center of, and it is a pulpy center, so it's basically a gel-like matrix. This particular figure is showing you what happens if a vertebral disc becomes herniated or broken, right? And there's a herniation and a part that pushes through. What the disc should do is it should provide an open space. Here's your spinal cord. This would be a nerve coming out. If you've ever heard of somebody who has a herniated disc or a bulging disc, the reason there is so much pain associated with it, and pain in different parts of the body, this part that's bulging is now pressing on a nerve. That nerve runs out to a body, and so that pain is transmitted to the brain. Okay. So those are the intervertebral discs, and we will talk in chapter 8, when we talk about the different joints, we'll talk a bit more about the intervertebral discs. Now, the general shape, we're going to look at the general shape of vertebra, and then we will look at the specifics and what differs between the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. Okay. What they all or most have are these main parts, where they have a body or the centrum. This is going to be the weight-bearing region. We will see differences in the shape of the body between the different kinds of vertebra. We will also see a vertebral arch and a vertebral foramen. This is going to be where you have the vertebral arch actually creates the foramen. The foramen is the opening, and the spinal cord will pass through the vertebral foramen. The vertebral arch is going to make up the vertebral foramen. There are also the spinous process, which projects towards the back, and then we'll see projecting out the sides, transverse processes. So let's take a look at a general vertebra. Here is the spinous process. This points out towards the back. This would be an example of a transverse foramen. Right? They kind of go out to the sides in a transverse manner. This would be the vertebral foramen. This is where the spinal cord would pass through. Here is the body. Okay, this is the weight-bearing part. These are the parts where the vertebral discs will sit. This whole region is called the vertebral arch, and the vertebral arch is made of the connection between the process, and then these regions that come out here, that's called pedicle, and the pedicle actually connects the entire thing together, right, creating the foramen. Now, as we look at the different kinds, we will see modifications to these, and that's what really classifies the cervical separate from the thoracic, separate from the lumbar, okay, based on what they have to do. So we'll start off with the cervical vertebrae. There are 7, C1 through C7. C1 and C2 are very special. They have a very unique shape, and they have their own names, and you will have to memorize these separately. Okay. C3 through C7 all have the same basic shape, where they have a very oval-shaped body, right? But it's very small. They have a fairly short spinous process. They have a almost triangle-shaped vertebral foramen. And the transverse process has a foramen. Okay, that's really the key thing here. So if we take a look at the cervical vertebra, these are overall kind of small. We have a nearly triangular-shaped vertebral foramen, a more oval-shaped centrum. The spinous process may be bifurcated or forked. Key thing, though, the thing that is completely different than any of the others are these transverse foramen right here. Transverse foramen are going to be very important. Okay, they are really what sets them apart. Now, if you take a look at this, the way these articulate is these are going to sit on top of one another. So the other thing you have to look at are what are called the articular process and the articular facets. The word articular, right, or to articulate means where two bones come together and articulate, right? They join up. The inferior articular process of this one will articulate with the one below it. Okay, so if we take a look at how those stack, that's how we'll put it together. Now I said C1 and C2 are special. C1 is called the atlas. The atlas has no body and it has no spinous process. It's basically a ring shape. It has a very important job here. So here is the atlas. We do see the transverse process with the transverse foramen. Right? No body to speak of. Here we have a superior articular facet that is separated. We have two different sides. Going to be very important. What will articulate here in the superior articular facet are the occipital condyles of the occipital bone of the skull. Right? So that's where the skull actually sits with and articulates. Now the movement that's allowed by the movement of these occipital condyles onto the articular facet of the atlas is that forward-backward movement, as if you were nodding your head. Okay? That's the kind of movement. Now the word atlas, if any of you guys are into Greek mythology, Atlas was forced to hold the world up on his shoulders, right? So you can imagine that that's what this bone does, right? It holds the skull up on its shoulders. Now just below it we have another very important bone, C2, which is called the axis. The axis has a structure in it called the dens, and that dens acts as a pivot point for the atlas. So what makes this different is instead of having a flat body, the body actually sticks up and points up, all right, and creates this structure called the dens. This does have a smaller body. It has the superior and, of course, the inferior articular facet. It has a transverse foramen. It does have a spinous process. So in order to understand what this dens does, we're going to have the ring of the atlas sitting on it, and then that is going to be able to twist around the axis, right? This is creating, even though the reason this bone is called the axis is here we're creating an axis. So when we put these cervical vertebrae together, we can see that movement, see that interaction. So up top here, this is the atlas. What we don't see is the skull. The skull would be sitting here. Now there is the dens, so we have this ring-like atlas sitting on top of the axis. There's a small piece of ligament that holds that in place. And where that ligament then is being held in place, this will allow for the no motion, the pivot of the skull. The rest of them stack on top of one another where the facets meet. Okay. In between there would be, sitting on the body's intervertebral discs. You can see the spinous process here. There are these bifurcation or splits, and that allows for there to be more flexibility and movement in the cervical vertebrae. We have a good deal of movement in the cervical vertebrae. So those are C1 through C7. You will have to be able to recognize and name specifically C1 and C2 as the atlas and axis. C3 through C7, I will not expect you to know which one is C3, which one is C4, which one is C5. Okay? Just identify them as being cervical. This is a nice review sheet to follow along with as we go through and talk about the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Right? What makes them different? What sets them apart? Okay, so you can refer back to that. So we've seen cervical. Now we're going to look at thoracic. Okay. The thoracic have that shape that we've basically used as our general shape. Okay. What's important and different with the thoracic vertebrae is they do have the ribs articulating in. So we will see what's called the transverse costal facet. This transverse costal facet is in this transverse process. we will have a facet. A facet is a smooth part where a bone will sit. And you will see that the rib will articulate in here and it comes around. So that's where the rib will articulate with the thoracic vertebra. There are 12 of these as well. Okay. These have a more heart-shaped body. If we look at them together, right, these have a much longer spinous process than we would have seen in either the lumbar or in the cervical. The superior and inferior articular facets, the way these come together, they are arranged very much anterior-posterior. Okay? So they allow for a little sliding motion, but no twisting motion. Right? So you cannot twist T3 on top of T4. Okay? Can anybody think about why that's really important? Why do we not want any twisting motion in the thoracic vertebrae? Not anyone said that for sever the spinal cord. It's setting up this important rib cage here that's protecting the heart and the lungs. Okay. The way we breathe is by having this specific shape to our thoracic cage. If we were able to twist that, we'd basically crush our lungs, right? We would compress our lungs. So we have very limited movement in the thoracic vertebrae, very limited movement. All of the other structures are there. We have the transverse process. Here's that transverse costal facet. We will see when we put the ribs in place how those interact. Okay. So these are going to articulate in a very anterior-posterior fashion. That's the way the facets face. Now the lumbar vertebrae, these are much stronger, so we're going to see much thicker, larger bodies. They have a very short, kind of blunt-shaped spinous process, and the way the articular facets are organized, they're going to be locked together more, right? So they're not going to be able to twist and turn. You might have, but you will be able to see some bending, like forward and backward. So these are much shorter, much stockier, if you will. These are much more designed for weight bearing. The superior and inferior articular facets then face much more lateral medial, right? So they're facing out and in. Right? This means that there's no side-to-side motion, right? But you can imagine there is some front-to-back motion. So there is some forward and backward bending available. Okay. If we compare just the thickness and the size of these, the vertebrae get progressively larger as we move down, right? Because they are going to be carrying progressively more weight. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae. Again, you will not have to identify 1 versus 2 versus 3. You will just have to identify a lumbar vertebra. Okay. The last one is the sacrum. The sacrum, we have 5 fused vertebrae that appear to be a single bone. Okay. This forms the posterior wall of the pelvis, the back wall of the pelvis. It articulates with L5. The other part is the tailbone or the coccyx. This is basically our vestigial tail. Right? It does vary in individuals as far as how many bones are actually fused and made up the tailbone. Okay. If we look at the anterior view, so basically we are looking from the front, in this we will see this part that comes out and is almost a wing shape is called the ala. That will be common throughout, that word ala meaning something wing-shaped. Okay. Here is where we will have articulation with L5. These are fused, so we no longer see separate structures. Okay, you can see these ridges. This is where the fusion has occurred. Okay, down over here, this is where we have the coccyx or the tailbone. Looking at the back, right, we no longer have separate vertebral foramen on each of these because they're fused. Instead, we create what's called the sacral canal. Right, it's a much longer structure. There's also this area here where we're going to see articulation with the bones that are going to create, when we look at the appendicular skeleton, are going to create the rest of the pelvis. Those will be the coxal bones or the hip bones. Okay. So that is the sacrum and the coccyx. So the next part of the axial skeleton then is going to be the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage we will see is composed of the ribs. Okay. The ribs will be forming the lateral portion. We'll have the sternum, forming the most anterior portion. And here's where we're going to see a very important interaction with the cartilage, the costal cartilage. Anytime you see costal, costal is going to have to do with the ribs. So this is the ribs, the cartilage of the ribs. Now, the bony thorax is quite important. The thoracic cage is quite important. It provides protection, creates a protective cage around the heart, the lungs, and the greater blood vessels. It's also going to provide a support point for the shoulders. When we look at the upper limb, the shoulders, arm, forearm, hand, they will actually have some interaction, and the only bone-to-bone interaction is going to be with that thoracic cage. We'll see there are going to be many muscles that attach. And then finally, what I would think might be the most important function is the muscles between the ribs called the intercostal muscles. These are going to be the muscles that allow for breathing to occur, that along with the diaphragm. Right, so pretty important functions. If we take a look at the bony thorax, we can see the different bones. So here is the sternum. The sternum is actually made of 3 bones. We'll talk about that in a moment. These are the ribs. Okay. Back here we have the thoracic vertebrae. The other important non-bone region would be the costal cartilages. All right, so this is the costal cartilage. The way these all form together, these are going to form a nice open space so your heart can sit in its proper position. Okay. And then you can have the arteries that come out forming the aorta, right, which is the main blood vessel leaving, okay, branching off into the carotid arteries, which are going to go up towards the brain. If there is a problem here, we would have compression. In fact, when you give someone chest compressions, do CPR, you actually compress this to try and force the heart to start beating again. Okay? So by putting pressure here, you actually do compress the heart. That's why it's called chest compressions. Okay? So you can see how these interact in terms of the curvature here being very important in forming that cage. So an important part of that is the sternum. Right? We commonly call it the breastbone, but the sternum is really the fusion of 3 bones, something called the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. The manubrium is up top here. It's got a kind of roughly heart-shaped structure to it. Okay. There are 2 notches in it. One is the jugular notch, one is the clavicular notch. The clavicular notch is where the clavicle will sit. Now, the clavicle is not shown here. The clavicle is the collarbone, and that's actually where the bone-to-bone attachment of your upper limb will be. Okay. And then the jugular notch is where you'll actually have the jugular passing. Right? It passes. There's a little seat for it. The other part here is called the body. Right? The body is the majority of this. The last part is called the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is a small amount of bone that projects down, kind of below the actual edges of the rib cage. Now the ribs themselves, we have 12 pairs of ribs. These are all attached at the back or posteriorly to the thoracic vertebrae. How they attach up front varies. So the first 7 pairs are called the true or vertebrosternal ribs because they attach both at the vertebral column and at the sternum. Right? Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are called the false ribs or the vertebrochondral ribs. The vertebrochondral ribs, these attach at the vertebral column, and then they attach to the sternum, but through an interface. They connect first, they all connect to cartilage, and then that cartilage connects. Okay. And then the last 2, 11 and 12, these are the floating or just the vertebral ribs, because they only attach to the vertebra. Now, if you take a look at this diagram here, your book double lists 11 is 12s, and it basically says that floating ribs are a subcategory of false ribs, which is sort of true, okay. But I think it just muddies the water. So I would make a note here and change these false ribs to just being 8 through 10, okay, so that false ribs and floating ribs are 2 separate things. Right? So here we can see 1 through 7, we have vertebra, rib, direct connection, right? There's a little bit of cartilage as opposed to here where the cartilage 8, 9, 10, and 11, cartilage connects to cartilage, connects to cartilage, connects to cartilage, connects to cartilage, okay? These floating ribs are the lowest ones. These only connect at the back. these are the most likely to be damaged in accidents and fights because they only have one point of attachment. If you take a cross-section of a rib, these are very small bones. They have an outer layer of that compact bone, a small amount of the spongy or woven bone inside. The way these form, ribs have an inherent curve to them. There is a region that is enlarged, that is the head of the rib. Okay. There is also a narrow part that would then be the neck of the rib. And finally, a little bump that comes out, and that's the tubercle of the rib. And those three things are going to interact with the vertebrae, right, and interact with the transverse costal facet to allow these to articulate in. The rib would then curve out, that's called the angle, right, and it comes out. If we look at this down, then we can see it much more clearly. Here we have the head, and it's kind of nestled here in the costal facet. That's where the articulation would occur. Then we have the tubercle of the rib, would sit right about here. And then we would have some small amount of ligaments holding this in place. Okay. Now there is some amount of flexibility here. There has to be a small amount of flexibility so that the ribs cage can expand and contract. Okay, drop and go. So that would be the overall shape. If you take a look at this, it has a loosely footprint shape. Okay, it's not exactly round, it's not exactly flat, and that has to do with where the muscle lines up. Okay. The intercostal muscles are very important in terms of breathing. Okay. They are very muscular. It's a very thick muscle there. I mean, if you go out and you buy ribs to eat, you are eating ribs, right? Ribs of a pig and or a cow, right? And they have that nice tender meat that runs along them. So it's basically what you're eating.